The terrible result of the president's policy. The American dead from last week's Kabul airport bombing given a dignified return. Mr. Biden was photographed apparently looking at his watch. An illustration say his critics of a president more concerned with Taliban deadlines than American dead. So for the president, this speech was important. He needed to explain and reassure.
This is the way the mission was designed. It was designed to operate under severe stress and attack, and that's what it did.
But there are still three big questions the president is struggling to answer. Mr. Biden has repeatedly promised that every American who wanted to leave would be brought home.
Are you committed to making sure that the troops stay until every American who wants to be out is out?
Yes.
But several hundred Americans have been left behind. Today, the president suggested that those were mostly people who had originally wanted to stay.
Most of those who remain are dual citizens, long-time residents who had earlier decided to stay because of their family roots in Afghanistan. The bottom line, 90% of Americans in Afghanistan who wanted to leave were able to leave. And for those remaining Americans, there is no deadline. We remain committed to get them out if they want to come out.
I think that is a black mark on Joe Biden's record unless we can get those people out. There's no question about that. Americans are very concerned. They want to evacuate all the Americans who are still there and as many of the translators and helpers as possible. And so, yes, this will definitely be a black mark on Biden's record.
The next challenge Mr. Biden had to address is how America repairs its tattered foreign policy and its fight against terrorism. Mr. Biden said America's presence in Afghanistan had actually long since started working against American safety.
This is a new world. The terror threat has metastasized across the world, well beyond Afghanistan. The fundamental obligation of a president, in my opinion, is to defend and protect America. Not against threats of 2001, but against the threats of 2021 and tomorrow.
The president said that America could now rely on so-called over-the-horizon capabilities like drone strikes to prevent terrorists again using Afghanistan as a base.
Afghanistan remains a landlocked, remote country, and if you have no physical presence there, which is the case as of today, it becomes harder to collect information about what's going on in other parts of the country and harder to identify and, if necessary, attack enemies as they rise up. So, yeah, it's a tough one, and it's not where the U.S. government thought it would be or wanted to be at this point.
Biden's final challenge is his domestic audience. His approval ratings have taken a tumble over Afghanistan. Despite this protest outside the White House recently, the policy of leaving is a popular one. He was, he said, the one who delivered on a promise.
When I was running for president, I made a commitment to the American people that I would end this war. Today, I've honored that commitment. It was time to be honest with the American people again. We no longer had a clear purpose in an open-ended mission in Afghanistan. After 20 years of war in Afghanistan, I refuse to send another generation of America's sons and daughters to fight a war that should have ended long ago.
But Mr. Biden's popularity now depends on how this departure is viewed, an embarrassing surrender or an unpleasant but dangerous necessity.
David Grossman with our first report there. Well, joining us now is Dominic Tierney, a conflicts author and political scientist, and Jenna Ben-Yehuda, President and CEO of the Truman Center for National Policy. Jenna, I wonder when you hear President Biden hailing this whole chapter as a success, how that's going to go down.
Well, I think the remarks were moving. They were convincing. They certainly speak to an overwhelming amount of support on behalf of the American people for the decision. But it's true also, I think, that his comments surrounding the tenor of the departure were defensive. And I think we saw some anger there. And certainly, I think there are those of us, myself included, who are somewhat discouraged by the way the last 2 weeks played out, despite what I think ultimately were heroic efforts on the part of the U.S. to draw down. As Dominic notes, there are so many left behind, and that is a big question for the president moving forward.
And mixed messages coming out of what he wanted that evacuation to look like. We understand from a Reuters report today that he'd had conversations with the former president, Ashraf Ghani, offered him aid for a smooth transfer. This clearly wasn't what Joe Biden wanted to happen, and yet he then turned on the president and on the Afghan troops themselves and said they were to blame.
Well, I think it's true that certainly ultimately the march of the Taliban was far more expeditious and widespread than analysts had estimated by most accounts. But it's also true that many groups, Truman among them, had long warned the White House for many, many months that the ability to evacuate people like our partners and allies, in particular Afghan interpreters, was going to take months and not a mere 10 days, as was ultimately the case. So the problem is far-reaching, and the sins and failures of Afghanistan extend back 20 years and not just over the last 2 weeks. So ultimately, the plans did not align with what ultimately happened. There were heroic efforts at the 11th hour, but that's what they were, the 11th hour. The big question remains, how do we move forward and get the rest of those people out?
OK, so let me ask Dominic, when Biden, who we know has always been against the war in Afghanistan, this goes back pretty much the full 20 years, but he said today we can't think about the old threats of 2001. We have to think about the new threats of 2021 and tomorrow. Presumably, many of those new threats are going to come from this withdrawal.
Well, you know, Biden's had a very long career in DC, and you know, back in the 1980s, he was sort of a moderate. In the 1990s, he was actually quite hawkish on foreign policy and supported a lot of military interventions, and even famously supported the invasion of Iraq. But since the invasion of Iraq, Biden has been really quite dovish consistently on foreign policy questions. And he was a voice of dovishness, of caution about intervention, really right through his time as vice president. And I think that he is just determined that he must end this war, that is a mission that he has, that he will not hand this over to the next president, a kind of sworn duty. But of course, the war is not really over in any meaningful sense. You know, we don't anymore have neat wars, which would neat start and neat end. Instead, Biden has enormous policy challenges now to try to deal with potentially ISIS in Afghanistan, while also negotiating some sort of arrangement with the Taliban to limit the damage, both for American interests and also for humanitarian issues.
And Jenna, when you hear that line from the president, the fundamental obligation, he said, is to defend and protect America, which essentially carries on the America First line that we heard so repeatedly from President Trump. Is he talking to Trump voters specifically there, or do you think this actually goes back to sort of, you know, pre-Trump era?
I actually see this as totally divorced from America First. Every nation should pursue its objectives in light of their own national interests. Working in support of American national interest is not Trumpian in nature. In fact, it's quite the opposite, I would argue. Having an America that has resources that are dedicated to focusing on those challenges that are most pressing to the United States is not an America First mentality. Far from it. Biden is not suggesting the abandonment of allies. He's not suggesting the United States go it alone. That is what is Trumpian.
He's not, but sorry, just to come in there, he's not at all suggesting the abandonment of allies. But nonetheless, many of his allies are now feeling slightly abandoned by the speed at which this happened. They don't know what to do. They don't know what their role is anymore.
Well, I think there's much to be seen moving forward. And I think some of these allies will have a different outlook. It certainly makes it somewhat challenging to continue to have an enduring presence there. But 2,500 troops, 5,000 troops, it was not going to continue to provide the same amount of security. We know that the terrorist attacks had increased. We know that the country had become increasingly destabilized. It's not to say that 2,500 or 5,000 troops would have continued to provide the same kind of security blanket moving forward.
So
what I think we can see from the president is a commitment to continuing to work with allies to look at those solutions as democracies band together to confront other challenges like China.
And when those democracies band together, this is to Dominic, it is a confusing place right now to be America's allies on this, because Britain is now trying to find out what her role is, whether she goes along with everything that America establishes in terms of diplomacy or ties or attitude to the Taliban. Essentially, America's allies have to fall in step, don't they?
Well, I think those
sorry,
allies...
I'm just to Dominic. I'm just going to bring Dominic in here. Dominic Tierney.
Sure, please.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, there are obvious tensions here that are caused by the withdrawal, and it's enormously challenging, not just for the United States, but for all its allies. And the particular difficulty is that if you're a junior partner in this process, which is true even for Britain, never mind the sort of smaller contributors to the war effort, then you may feel that the rug was sort of pulled away from under your feet. That said, I actually am fairly confident that the Western alliance can survive Afghanistan. It's survived bigger crises in history. I think Biden, at the heart of the Biden doctrine, and this does go back decades, is a deep commitment to multilateralism, is a deep commitment to alliances. And as was noted, the rise of China is going to provide a profound force that could bring global democracies together. It's just that alliances are difficult, and you know, underneath these partnerships, there's often some ferocious back and forth. You know, it's not always just a come by our story.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for joining us.